Weiss was voted most likely to be famous by her high school classmates. And as the founder of Glossier and one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world, she seems to be living up to that superlative. Now, I've actually done a video on Glossier before. I did their brand story a little over 2 years ago, so I really debated revisiting the Glossier story again. But the rebirth that they have undergone in the last 2 years alone needs to be studied. They've had a change in CEO, they've launched in major beauty retailer Sephora, but perhaps the biggest catalyst for the Glossier redemption arc was an unplanned TikTok video by a creator with only 300 followers at the time. So today I want to revisit that Glossier story, talk about their growth up until this point, and the major changes they've made in the past 2 years to salvage what appeared to be a sinking ship. If you're new here, I'm Kelly. I love to talk about beauty. These brand deep dive stories are some of my absolute favorites, and in preparation for this video, I read this book. It was really fascinating. I will leave it linked down below. If you nerd out on this stuff the same way I do, I think you would love the book. It was written by journalist Marisa Meltzer, and even though I knew the Glossier story pretty well because I'd covered it in that video a few years back, this book released after that, and it was really interesting to get even more pieces behind the scenes. So I will have it down below. But to tell the Glossier story, first we have to discuss their fascinating founder, Emily Weiss. A lot of times when I hear Emily described, she's really written off as just this rich girl with a lot of connections and opportunities that inevitably started a successful company. But even though there is definitely more to Emily the person, in a lot of ways that describes her pretty well. She does come from a wealthy family. She grew up in a very wealthy neighborhood in Connecticut, and from a young age, she was afforded a lot of opportunities that the average person could only dream of. And throughout her life, she was able to leverage a lot of these resources and connections to her benefit. And that's not to minimize Emily's hard work throughout her life, but that is to say her privileged background made it easier for her to be in the right rooms to find a level of success. The perfect example of this was how she got her first internship at Ralph Lauren as a teenager. She just asked the family that she babysat for. She said, "Hey, you have a connection, I want to work at Ralph Lauren, can you make that happen for me?" And sure enough, she got the job. She also later leveraged her connections to get an internship at Teen Vogue. And if you ever watched The Hills, you might be familiar with Emily as the intern on Teen Vogue. Yes, she had a little cameo on the show for 3 episodes. And on the show, she was positioned as like the hardworking, good intern to really contrast the other cast members. But that wasn't just fictional, scripted reality television. She really was working at Vogue, and she really was viewed as a good, hardworking intern. And something I found interesting in the book was a lot of stories from Emily's former classmates or former colleagues, and the way that they would describe her style. They would say she was always kind of overdressed compared to everyone else. A lot of her former classmates from high school would say that people would just come to school dressed kind of for sports, kind of more casually, but she would be wearing high heels, designer clothing. And that same idea was echoed by her former colleagues at these various internships, saying that she was dressing like she was the editor of the magazine, not the intern. And after her time at Vogue, she leveraged those connections to get an assistant job at W Magazine, staying in print media. And this was the time that she decided to start her blog in 2010. At this time, she was still working a second job, and she would write on her blog all through the middle of the night. And now I need you to transport mentally back to 2010 for a moment, because this was the golden era of blogging. Bloggers were kind of the original influencers. Before TikTok and Instagram even existed, we had bloggers. They were really the first iteration of the social media influencer that we know today. But Emily, with her background in fashion, wanted to bring a beauty perspective to her blog because she felt like so many magazines were covering fashion, but none of them were sharing what the models were wearing on their face, what the celebrities were doing with their skincare routines. So she felt like she could fill that hole through her blog into the gloss. And specifically through this segment on the blog called Top Shelf, where she again leveraged the many connections she was able to make. She's a fantastic networker, but she was able to call on these connections she had of models and celebrities and interview them about their routine, take photos in their bathroom, sharing their shelves, sharing the products that they're using, and showing that to her audience, which at the time, through a 2025 lens, if you're hearing this today, that's probably sounding completely unremarkable. But again, I need you to imagine this through 2010 eyes. Social media didn't exist in the way that we know it today. Like today, you could probably go follow your favorite celebrity on Instagram, and she might share her favorite sunscreen on her story, and then you'd get that knowledge that way. But we didn't have as much access in 2010 as we do today. So this was really juicy and exciting for her readers to kind of get the curtains pulled back on their favorite celebs. Also, even just to paint a picture of that time period, this was the peak of reality television. You know, this was the first time audiences were truly being exposed to celebrities in this light. And her blog was wildly successful. By 2012, they had already rented out an office and were seeing 8.5 million page views per month, which led to In The Gloss ultimately pairing up with some of your favorite and most well-known beauty brands to do sponsorships on the blog, which again, I know probably sounds so unremarkable today because we're used to seeing this type of partnership, but at the time, that was a new territory. Prior to that, we were only seeing legacy media partner with beauty brands in this way. So to see someone do it on their personal blog and for the rates that Emily was getting was a big deal. And something I want to point out about her blog is that it felt very strategic to the subsequent success of her beauty brand Glossier, whether intentional or not. The way she positioned beauty products on her blog really contrasted the norm in that time. In 2010, a makeup product was a very utilitarian purchase. You were buying it so it would do something for you. You know, you're buying a blush because it's going to perform well. You're not necessarily seeking out which blush best matches your identity, which brand is most aligned with your personality and your taste. No, you're buying a product because you're expecting it to perform well. In that time, we didn't necessarily think of our consumable products as an extension of ourselves, but Into the Gloss served to shape that mental shift for the consumer. You know, she was photographing all these celebrities' shelfies. You were seeing what was in their bathroom. Suddenly, you wanted your medicine cabinet to look as curated and aesthetic as your favorite celebrities that you were reading about on the Gloss. And Into the Gloss was wildly successful, rivaling the readership of her legacy media competitors. And Emily's wondering what is her next step? Well, enter Glossier, the beauty brand. And from the start, Emily wanted to approach the brand in a different way than a lot of established beauty brands of the time. She was essentially trying to force a tech approach into the creation of a beauty brand, viewing it really as a startup. And Emily has spoken extensively about how much of a struggle it was for her to find funding for this company. Even though she had this wildly successful blog, she couldn't find anyone that would take a chance on her beauty brand. And she's spoken about how challenging specifically that it is for female founders to obtain VC funding and what a small percentage of funding ends up going to female founders in general. And after pitching Glossier many times, she finally found Kristen Green, founder of Forerunner Ventures, who made that first investment into Glossier to begin the brand. They received $1 million, which went to leasing a proper office, finding a chemist, buying inventory, and hiring a small team of employees. And in the beginning, the very first launch from Glossier was pretty minimal. It included a moisturizer, a face mist, a lip balm, and a skin tint. And for context again, we need to mentally transport ourselves back to 2014 when this brand launched. The makeup trends looked nothing like this skin tint launch that we were getting from Glossier. 2014 was the era of full glam, high coverage, heavy contour. Glossier was the antithesis of this. And for even more context, it's so funny to think back now about some of the reviews I remember hearing about the Glossier skin tint. People were outraged, like, this has no coverage, like, this is literally just water. Flash forward to today, it looks very similar to a lot of other skin tints on the market, but at the time we were used to and demanding such a high level of coverage that a lot of people didn't even get what Glossier was trying to do. You could say in many ways they were kind of ahead of their time. And at a time when most other beauty brands were capitalizing on this full glam trend, Glossier was one of the only brands offering something different. The advertising was very young, it was very youthful, it was very pink. And this specific shade of Glossier pink you might be familiar with. It really ruled the 2010s, and you might know it as millennial pink. In 2016, The Cut released an article titled, "Why is millennial pink suddenly so popular?" Writing, "A cohort raised to distrust pink has turned contrarian and embraced a muddied, faded version of the color this summer, or conspicuously drinking a matching glass of frosé and Instagramming it all with our rose gold iPhones." Meltzer, author of the book that I referenced, mentions visiting Emily Weiss's home to interview her. and saying that the decor in her home even felt reflective of this very curated Glossier image, both in the colors and overall theme. If there is one thing Glossier has done very well from day one, it is branding. You can look at a Glossier advertisement and just know by the font and the colors used that it is Glossier. They are very intentional with this messaging. But returning to that foundation that Into the Gloss really laid for Glossier, the beauty brand, Emily Weiss primed readers of her blog to seek out beauty products that were aesthetically pleasing, that looked nice in a vanity or in a shelfie. And that's what Glossier delivered on. Consumers were starting to view their shopping as an extension of themselves and what it says about themselves and what brands am I buying and how is that reflecting my personality and who I want to be. And I remember at the time of launch hearing people talk about this Glossier girl. It was this very carefully curated aesthetic that relied on this very minimalistic makeup look, but also leaned into the heavy usage of that very specific shade of Glossier pink. The Glossier girl also was someone that was naturally very beautiful because the makeup launches didn't provide much coverage or contour. They didn't necessarily have the power to transform the wearer the way other makeup products that were popular at the time did. You know, it was that no makeup look, which is popular today, but wasn't necessarily the trend at the time. And I'll even say what I've heard anecdotally from subscribers is almost feeling excluded from this vision of Glossier. Like it was a very specific person. You were either the Glossier girl or you were not. There was a very rigid idea of who the Glossier girl was. And even though they attempted to curate this faux image of inclusivity by showcasing models that have maybe gaps in their teeth, lots of freckles, but at the end of the day, they're all very conventionally attractive models with perfect skin. And if you didn't fit that description, Glossier didn't really feel like a brand that was for you, which really contrasted the way Emily Weiss would describe her vision for the brand. She wanted Glossier to be welcoming and inclusive. She even specifically compared it to that scene in Pretty Woman where Julia Roberts is made to feel unwelcome at that boutique. But I find a lot of irony in Emily's vision for Glossier, feeling very distant from the way that I've generally heard the brand described. You know, Glossier was almost a status symbol, having your little pink bubble wrap pouch that your packaging came in. If you wore Glossier, you were a cool girl. Meltzer described Glossier as the cafeteria table you wanted to sit in the high school of life. And their consumers wanted to fit this Glossier mold so badly that they ultimately did a lot of Glossier's advertising for them, creating Instagram accounts like Dogs of Glossier, Boyfriends of Glossier, posting extensively about the brand and mirroring that very curated image that Glossier was selling. In the early days, they even created a customer loyalty program that was structured almost like an MLM, where some of their most loyal customers would have their own landing page to shop from and encourage people to buy more Glossier products. And it was all working pretty well for them. In those early years, it was like Glossier could do no wrong. The brand grew over 600% year over year in 2016. They were growing so fast they were running into supply chain issues and having trouble keeping up with such high order quantities. And this explosive growth for Glossier led to their first brick and mortar store in 2016. It was previously a pop-up but became a permanent showroom. It's been described as adult Disneyland, and the employees, who are called offline editors, all wore pink jumpsuits. And instead of your traditional cash registered checkout experience, you would purchase your items through those offline editors on an iPad. And that was a highly coveted job by Glossier superfans. Round one of the interview process to be an offline editor at a Glossier store was to send in a self-tape video. And these stores were so popular. I remember trying to visit the Soho, like original store before I lived in New York. This was maybe 2017, 2018, like it had been open for a little bit, but I remember trying to go and the line was down the street, like around the corner, and I was like, I'm not waiting in that line. But the Glossier stores have consistently held hype and always had lines. And especially when these first launched in the mid 2010s, that was really the peak of like Instagrammable moments. Every business wanted to create what was essentially a backdrop for your Instagram photo. You know, think of the Color Factory, any experience like that. I mean, this was like peak millennial culture. The Glossier store almost served as, again, more free promotion for the brand. Yes, it was a retail experience where customers could buy products, but even more than that, it was a chance for customers to post more about the brand. You're going into this beautiful, really visually stimulating store. Of course, you're gonna post about it on Instagram. It was a win-win for Glossier. Flash forward to today, outside of some snags with stores closing during the pandemic, but as of today, Glossier has stores in almost every major city in the US, as well as a store in London. But another reason those stores were so successful was it was the only place you could go to touch and feel a Glossier product before buying it. Glossier was exclusively direct to consumer at this time, and they did that very intentionally. They chose to do things a bit differently than a lot of makeup brands of that era. And you know, again, you gotta think of the time. This is the mid-2010s. It was the heyday of direct to consumer products. Not necessarily selling through a retailer, but selling directly from your own website. There was something exciting and alluring about it. And it was a core part of Glossier's identity. It was really clear from the beginning that they wanted to be seen as a disruptor. They wanted to do things differently. And this really influenced the way that Emily led the business. She wanted Glossier to kind of be like a tech company. People would constantly ask her, are you a tech company or a beauty company? And her response famously would be, yes. And a lot of former employees at the Glossier office really backed this up, saying that the work environment there mirrored that of a popular tech startup, both in the office culture and even kind of just this vague vision that they seemed to have for taking the company. They said the Glossier headquarters seemed very inspired by like a Google campus, where they wanted the office to be really appealing to employees, have lots of snacks on site. They had a florist come in every week and do new flower arrangements, while the employees were saying, we don't really want this. We would love if you could just pay us more. But again, it calls back to this idea of this like tech influence in the beauty brand. And we saw this very relevant in the way that Emily would do interviews. She would so often quote and reference very well-known tech founders. She was inspired by them and she aspired to be like them. So at this time, Glossier has done many rounds of funding. They have gotten a ton of capital. At their peak, they were valued at $1.8 billion. And with this huge influx in money, Glossier was really pressured to grow quickly. But through that, they were seemingly losing the vision and that original identity of the Glossier brand. And that became clear in 2019 when they launched their weird sister brand Play. Do you remember this? It was the most bizarre launch. There was really no strategy with Play, a former high-level employee said about the brand. And even from the consumer perspective, I think we all kind of saw that to be the case. Play was the direct opposite of Glossier. If Glossier was minimal, no makeup, Play was like Euphoria style makeup before Euphoria, the show, even came out. It was colorful, it was glittery, it was opaque, it was antithetical to the Glossier identity, and it felt entirely random. The Glossier consumer wasn't buying it, both figuratively and literally. And in less than a year, they quietly closed down Play. But at the time that they were playing around with Play, pun intended, they were also experimenting with the idea of other beauty brands. You know, Play wasn't necessarily going to be the only one. They considered a few other things that they could have under the Glossier umbrella. There were rumors that they were talking about a brand for more mature skin. There were even rumors, actually I don't even think this was a rumor, Emily Weiss has said that she has considered creating a Glossier hotel. You know, they're trying to do a little bit of everything. They don't really know what they're doing, or at least they didn't in the late 2010s. Meltzer interviewed many former employees for her book, and they all kind of said the same thing, that the working environment at the office was not a good one. Saying things were chaotic in the office. They talk about employees laying on the floor, crying at work, staying super late hours, feeling very disconnected from what Glossier was doing, not knowing the future plans of the brand. They were also trying to create this app. They had a separate tech team trying to make an app, and then they had their beauty team. It was kind of a mess. The brand seemed to be growing faster than they could manage, but that wasn't the first or last occasion of Glossier employees speaking out about bad working conditions. You might remember the Instagram account Outta The Gloss that started posting in the year 2020, sharing stories from their time working at Glossier retail stores. They were calling for a boycott of Glossier, sharing stories of how managers kept mixing up names of women of color that worked at the store, confusing them for one another. There were some teens teens that kept coming into the store, applying blackface with the foundation, kind of laughing. It was never handled by the store. They were never asked to leave and they continued to come back. These are just few of many examples that the account shared. And they noted that they didn't feel that their employee concerns were taken seriously. They shared their demands with Glossier, and there was a bit of a back and forth for a while before Glossier ultimately released a public statement. It was relatively vague, talking about their plans for the future, but it's actually unclear if or how this was resolved, because in December of 2020, that Outta The Gloss account went silent and we never heard from them again. So I'm sure something happened behind the scenes. I would imagine legally they can't say much more. Perhaps they had to sign some NDA. We never really saw what the resolution there was. And so at that point, the public perception of Glossier had majorly shifted. And that was reflected in their sales in subsequent years. Sales in 2021 were down 26% from 2020, and certainly the pandemic probably played a role in that. But I would argue that customers were just becoming a bit disillusioned with the Glossier brand in general by this time. You know, this once very unique brand was starting to feel pretty cliche. That Instagram forward marketing was pretty common and stale at this point. And what worked for the brand in the 2010s was not translating to consumers in the 2020s. And not only that, but this very minimal makeup look that Glossier was known for was pretty available everywhere. There was a time when we didn't have many options to buy a skin tint from, and Glossier was one of your few choices. But that's changed, and Glossier has a lot more competitors making that same style of makeup than they did when they first launched. And this led to Glossier laying off a third of its staff in 2022. And most of those that were laid off were from the tech side, because they had abandoned this app that they were trying to create. They decided to redirect into the company that they actually have, which is a beauty brand. Later that year, Emily Weiss stepped down as CEO and was replaced by KELLYG, an alum of Nike and Cole Haan. And I will say, she had a tough job ahead of her. Glossier seemed to be on the verge of death. But a big part of their redemption strategy here was launching at Sephora. Yes, Glossier, that built its identity on being this direct-to-consumer brand, was pivoting to sell in major beauty retailer Sephora. So the following year in 2023, in the very beginning, they launched at Sephora, making them more accessible to consumers. Emily later said in an interview with Elle, "I really used to think Glossier would be a direct consumer forever." Fast forward to 2022, and the #1 comment on any TikTok was, "Will you please sell Glossier in Sephora?" And a year after that, she said they did $1 million in sales at the retailer's North American locations. She followed that up by saying, referring to TikTok suggesting they launch in Sephora, she said, "The comments are almost always right." But that was not the only time that TikTok helped redirect Glossier. Debatably the biggest pivot that Glossier has made in the last 2 years outside of launching at Sephora was their increased focus in fragrance. So let's go back for a moment to 2017 when they first launched their perfume You. I know that this has been reformulated and people say it smells very different today. I never knew the original You, so I can't speak to that, but I do love You. This perfume was developed by famous perfumer Frank Vogel, who interestingly enough also helped create the wildly popular Santal 33 for Le Labo. And from the beginning, this perfume was very loved. It even won a Fifi Award, which is a big deal in the fragrance space. But what makes You so different from a lot of other perfumes, and a lot of the appeal for this, is that it doesn't have any top notes. So because of that, it's supposed to smell very different on everyone. You know, the perfume is You. And even though it was successful and well-loved from that initial launch, it really reached its peak in 2022 after a viral TikTok video revived its popularity. A TikTok creator with 300 followers at the time posted a video talking about how many compliments she would get when she wore the perfume.
A gay guy that was going for a run just ran past me, then turned around to chase me, to ask me what scent I was wearing, and it's the same scent I was wearing when a guy that I went on 2 dates with wrote a poem about how good his pillow smelled after I left, and the only answer is Glossier You.
And from that video alone, sales exploded. Bloomberg shared an article in 2024 titled "How Glossier Turned a Viral Moment for You Perfume into a Lasting Business." They wrote, Chief Marketing Officer Cleona Mack scanned through the cosmetic company's revenue figures from the previous day in an internal program called Looker. It showed that Glossier had sold 6,000 bottles of its You perfume, up from about 600 the day prior. Mac was baffled. I immediately sent a Slack and said, oh guys, I think the looker system is broken. Something's wrong because it's showing 10 times sales. A colleague responded by sending over the TikTok saying it must be this. And Glossier was able to capitalize on this. They jumped into action quickly, putting a task force together, tracking hourly sales of you, sending out PR to more creators to post about you, putting in additional orders for their upcoming You deodorant that was scheduled to launch next, as well as paying to boost that TikTok video for a few additional weeks. So if you don't know, companies can go in and pay to whitelist a video, so basically get it to be more and more promoted. So they chose to do that on her video. I looked at it today and it's currently sitting at over 14 million views. In addition to all their focus on the perfume, they also started gifting future dew to anyone that bought the fragrance to help encourage crossover from their perfume shoppers to their beauty products. And so by the end of 2022, sales of the perfume You were 3 times higher than they were before that viral video. KELLYG says, we genuinely believe that this is the next Chanel No. 5, the next major fragrance for the next generation, which is a big and bold claim, but Glossier is really betting on that. They are leaning into perfume heavily. And in 2024, with help again from Frank, they launched 2 new iterations of You. They call these impressions of You. We have You Do and You Rev. I love these, I will say. Out of everything I've tried from Glossier, I think their perfumes are the best of the line. Like, I get why they're so popular. The scents are phenomenal. The only downfall, in my opinion, is the longevity. They don't last that long. But going back to the You extension in 2024, that was the brand's biggest launch to date, which was in part because of the high ticket price of fragrance compared to the beauty and skincare products that they sell. Buying the full-size version of this duo together would be $150, which is about 3 times the brand's average order size. So at a time when makeup is experiencing a slowdown, but fragrance is more popular than ever, it's a brilliant strategy for Glossier to pivot so heavily into their perfumes. And just a month ago, they released the newest iteration of You Fleur. I just picked this up at Sephora a couple of days ago. I have to say, it's fantastic. There's not a single one of these that I don't like. They're all so good, but this perfume illustrates the emphasis that Glossier is placing on fragrance right now. I visited their Williamsburg store just a few days ago in preparation for this video, and right when you walk through the door, the very first table is their perfumes. All 4 scents, and naturally that's probably partially because this is their latest launch, but even still, the perfumes are front and center, and then you have to go further back in the store before you get to the makeup and the skincare. And KELLYG has shared that Glossier becoming a fragrance house is a major goal for the company. I will not be surprised to see Glossier launch more and more perfumes in coming years. And this is a decision Glossier has made in the last few years that I think has been instrumental in saving the brand, because they've diversified themselves enough. They've got makeup products, they've got skincare products, and they have a fragrance line. So when the market shifts, they're able to pivot their focus into that other category. And right now, when makeup is struggling, skincare is also not doing great, but fragrance is selling numbers, Glossier has turned their attention in a major way into their fragrances. Lehigh says, we operate like a lifestyle brand, which feels in line with the identity that we've known of Glossier since its inception. But what does a lifestyle brand look like in 2025? That's a question Glossier is trying to answer. We've seen them try to embrace a younger Gen Z audience with Olivia Rodrigo as an ambassador for a few months. And I don't doubt that they're working on other ways to captivate a younger Gen Z audience and probably also Gen Alpha. I even want to point out the significance of the packaging of their latest launch, Fleur. I know it's easy to write it off as, oh, they chose purple because it's pastel and this is a floral and they wanted to lean into that. And sure, it certainly plays a role. But Glossier was a brand that held on to the identity of millennial pink or Glossier pink. But Gen Z also has its own assigned color. It is called Gen Z Purple, and the shade is this. The transition from this original bottle to their latest launch feels symbolic in a lot of ways. Because again, they could have leaned into a variety of different pastel shades to evoke this imagery of a floral scent. But no, they specifically chose Gen Z purple. Glossier has also kept up with the idea of being a lifestyle brand with their ongoing partnership with the WNBA, which I will say, I love women's basketball. I am not a sports person at all. I don't watch any sports for the most part, but I love the New York Liberty. If you've never been to a WNBA game, dare I say they are way more fun than NBA games, or as I like to call them, MNBA games. But in line with that ongoing partnership, Glossier has recently launched a limited edition pink basketball with the logo "You Look Good" across it. And the basketball was one of the many merch products for sale when I went into the Glossier store. That's another thing. They love merch because again, it helps sell the image of a lifestyle. You don't just use Glossier products. You're a Glossier girl, you're a Glossier guy, you're a Glossier user. It's more than just a product. It's an identity. And slowly but surely, Glossier seems to be redeeming itself in the public eye. You know, they were once the ultimate cool girl brand, but in a lot of ways, that image held them back from growing and evolving. Because the idea of being a cool girl brand is contingent on some level of exclusivity. Glossier felt cool because in a lot of ways, it felt unattainable. It was viewed as a brand for naturally pretty people to remind the world that they were naturally pretty and they didn't need coverage or contour, especially at a time when coverage and contour were all the rage. Not everyone could be a Glossier girl, which is why it felt so unattainable yet aspirational. And even though they started with this incredibly loyal fan base, growing and scaling a company whose perhaps unintentional but yet very real message to customers is, "We're too cool for you," poses a major challenge. So now Glossier is strategically working on captivating a new customer base, while still trying to maintain most of that original tone and identity from the original Glossier that we once knew, but evolved for a 2025 consumer. It really felt like they were on the brink of death in 2023, and the fact that they pulled this off is a pretty impressive feat. So let me know what you think. Has Glossier made a true comeback, or are you still waiting to be convinced?